Okay, so I am recording. If you want to say something off record, just let me know so I can pause. So I thought we could maybe tackle two things in this call, unless anyone has something urgent that they want to do. Lynn, you were saying that you've been looking at Peter Gray around reading, which has been quite
Yes,
profound for you. So I thought we could maybe spend some of the time in the call unpacking that and sharing what you found and discussing it further, also with reference
great.
to
That
the
would be
whole
great.
remedial environment.
Yes,
Especially
yes.
if it's a small group tonight, then that would be a good time to focus on kind of your speciality. And then
Okay.
we are about to head into our final month. So I'd
Wow.
like to
Hmm.
I'd like to maybe have a little bit of a review around what has worked, what hasn't worked, what we still want to cover, what we want to do with the remaining time, and sort of just spend a
Okay.
little bit of time looking at that tonight so that we can sort of set the month ahead. So,
Hmm.
is there anything else apart from those two items that anybody else wants to tuck into tonight?
No, I think on my side that's good.
Hmm. Okay.
I'm okay with that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well then, shall we start with your adventures, Lynn? Would you like to tell us a little bit
Yeah,
about what you've been doing?
yeah, I'd appreciate that. I think it will help me to speak about it, to articulate it, so that I can kind of rethink through the
Mm-hmm.
things that I've read and thought about.
Yeah.
So at the beginning of this course, I made the point that what I wanted to learn was how kids with remedial issues, whether that's dyslexia, which is obviously my area of main concern and interest, how they were kind of helped or handled in a self-directed environment, because I think my fear was that a child who was going to battle to read in a mainstream environment, they are given the sort of necessary support, or the support that everybody thinks that they ought to have from a relatively young age. But in an SDE environment, my perception was kind of it's child led, and the child is not necessarily going to go into the area that they find really hard. So you might lose a few years. And then I was thinking, in terms of the way I've been schooled, that's kind of a disastrous thing, because then they can't ever catch up, and you're basically doing more harm to the child. So
Mm.
so I was coming with that sort of um, you know that whole approach, and it's taken me a long time to try and unpack why that isn't so much of an issue as I thought it was. And I think I'm beginning to see a glimmer of light,
Mm.
in the sense that, from everything I've read, kids in an unschooled environment or an SDE environment, they learn at their own pace.
Mm.
So that when you take them outside of school, that means that there isn't the pressure to learn, like by the age of 8, that they absolutely have to be able to read. Because when you're teaching a large class, you have to have kids able to read the worksheet and do the test and answer the assessment. And if you have half of the class unable to read, it becomes a genuine disaster.
Mm.
you know so
Yeah.
it's in the interests of the school and the whole school kind of environment, to have kids able to read as soon as possible, so that you can manage their learning in a very lockstep kind of way, if I can say.
Yeah.
So in an SD environment, though, it's completely turned on its head, because a child can learn in 100 different ways, or 1,000 different ways. Okay, they can be visual, they can learn through moving, they can play in the sandpit for 4 years, and then play video games for 2 years, and hang out on the couch with a friend for another year, and then perhaps find an area of academic interest that they want to pursue. So if they only learn to read at the age of 12, it's not a disaster.
Mm.
And it's such a different way of thinking about things, that it's kind of taken me a long time to really to really start to understand it and to grasp it. But I think I'm getting there. And what really helps is being able to read and immerse myself in the examples of of people who homeschool and unschool and who have kids in an SDE environment. And it's their observations of their own kids and some who learn to read at the age of 4 or 5 or 6 or 12 or 16. It's fascinating to see that this happens in the real world, because as a teacher in a school environment, you literally never ever come across this. It just doesn't happen, because as I say, a child who can't read at the age of, let's say, like 8 or 9 is a train wreck, is regarded as being a disaster.
Mm.
And so it's been really, it's just an incredible experience to see things in a completely different way. And it's quite confusing as well. I feel like everything's turned upside down, and but
Yeah.
it's exciting. It's exciting at the same time. So it's really nice to be able to talk about it, because I mean, I'm living in an environment where this kind of thing it's heresy. you,
Yep.
you can't talk like. So I feel very like, underground type thing. So, but it's enormously. I mean, it changes everything, because it basically means that then I'm part of a system that puts kids through enormous pressure and stress that's completely unnecessary. So it's actually, it's beyond appalling, actually.
Sure.
Anyway, so I'm unpacking those. I'm unpacking it, and it's like an onion. I'm peeling off the layers, and it's just quite remarkable, actually. And I just wish that I'd been exposed to all of this stuff years ago. But it's not it's not easily accessible in the
Mm.
mainstream. It just isn't there. So yeah,
Yeah.
that's it in a nutshell, really.
Wow. So you've really kind of gone through a paradigm shift, really, I think.
I, I'm going through that,
And you're
yeah,
still
at the
reeling
moment.
to integrate it.
I am.
Yeah.
It's really, I think, because I've been schooled, so I went through the whole 12 years and I hated it, but I didn't understand why or how it could be different in any way. And then having my own kids, wanting to do the very best for each one of them, and they are so different. They've handled school in completely different ways, but it hasn't been a good experience for any of them.
Mm.
And it's taken me this long to really start to reflect on why and how it could be different. And I kind of I'm beginning to feel this passion in my heart about the fact that I hope that perhaps I can be a part of making this information more accessible to the mainstream, so that it becomes an option, because it's not an option at the moment, because nobody knows about it.
Yeah.
Or at least it's so invisible. It's not ever spoken about. I think the vast majority of folk who I engage with every day, they literally don't even know that there's another way. So it's confusing, and it's really inspiring and exciting at the same time. So yeah, I'm reading a ton, and I feel like I'm kind of on my own. I'm in an SDE experience right now.
There you go.
Very,
Yeah, and you're
very
going into
fun.
territory that nobody else would lead you into. Um,
Yes,
and they
exactly.
think you're crazy
Yeah.
for even heading into these wilds. And as you say, you're
Yes, I
kind of,
haven't even,
mm,
no, I haven't articulated it to the people I work with, because they will shout me down from a dizzy height. So I feel like I need to have all my ducks in a row before I even raise my hand.
mm, mm,
Yeah.
yeah,
So that's
Then
it in a nutshell.
um, I may be able to contribute a little bit here. Andrew here.
Yes, hi Andrew.
1970,
Hmm.
I took on the post of senior English teacher at Treverton College in Natal, which is a private
Oh,
school.
I know that school. Well, I've heard of
Okay.
a lot about it. Yes.
And it was the first matric class to
Okay.
be at the school.
Yes.
And we were looking for numbers to make it viable.
Yes.
And I think in the grade 9 class, that was standard 7 in those days,
Yeah.
I I taught every class English. In So the intake was very often, I would say probably about 10-15% of the boy, it was a boys' school, the boys who
Mm.
were admitted to the school because the school needed the money and
Okay.
because the boys hadn't succeeded at other schools.
Yes, yes.
And they had just been put into this class because of their age. So it was dealing with
Okay.
13, 14-year olds who could not read.
Mm.
Some, and it was embarrassing and stressful for them to have to read aloud in class because that was the reading development process in those days. So
Yes,
what
yes.
I did was first of all, we had set books, and set books weren't always appropriate. So
Mm.
once a week, I would have a reading class where I read to the class.
Okay.
And I got the um, regional library to send out a library truck, and
Mm.
we started a library in the school.
Wow.
Choose books that were appropriate, interesting, but not at advanced levels of difficulty. And I could
Yeah.
match to a boy,
Mm.
knowing that basically we could start reading this for one period, and maybe half of the class wouldn't be interested in the book. Some of them would be
Mm.
mildly interested, but it was aimed at one child. And then at the end of the class, I would say, well, okay, how did you like that? And if you want to take this book out, it's up in the library.
Okay. Huh.
And so quite often
Lovely.
they would come up and they would say, in those days it was very formal, so I was addressed as Sir, that
Mm.
book you read this morning, is it in the library still? Has somebody else got it? Because I'd like to take it out.
Mm.
And so it was self directed to some extent, but it was
Yes.
what Jana calls seeding.
Strewing.
Brewing. Yes,
And
I've heard you talk about that. Yeah.
in quite a few cases, it worked very well. Then I
Okay.
made contact with a reading expert in the Department of Education. In those
Mm.
days, we don't know what we know today.
Mm.
And he gave me a reading assessment link
Okay.
where we would do a reading comprehension assessment. But he said, don't worry about the comprehension scores or the speeding comprehension scores. You're looking at two different things. You're looking at reading power. Do they understand what they're reading? And how fast do they read? And in some cases, we were able to get measurable improvement just by the method of reading a book that would then be taken out.
Mm.
Okay.
Because their
And maybe the
interest was
first time a child had ever taken that book out and read on
Mm.
his own.
mm,
Mm.
because their interest was
So
sparked, and they were reading for
what
a
I'm saying
purpose.
is really, Lynn, I think what you're doing is perfectly possible. It's done how many years ago? 35 years ago.
Mm. Mm. Yeah. So
Are
so
we
what
still there?
what's yeah, that's really really interesting. In
Can you
terms
hear
of
me?
yes,
Yes, we
yes, I
can hear
can.
you.
Can you hear us, Andrew?
Sorry, have I?
Do you hear me? I seem to have lost you there.
Yes, yes, I'm here. I can hear you.
Hello?
Hello. Oh, yeah, he
Okay.
definitely can't hear us.
Yeah, and I think he's not seeing the text either.
Okay.
I'll just quickly phone him.
Okay.
Okay, no, he's clicked out.
He
I
is
think he's
coming.
seen it. He's seen
Hmm.
it. Okay. Let's just give him a moment to return.
Okay. I want to add a link here actually.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Here's a link to a book that discusses Learning to read in an unschooling environment. I don't know. I don't actually think that's exactly the right way to describe it, but it's really, I'm busy with it at the moment. I'm hoping it will send a picture to you and not just a link, but is everybody there still?
Yes, and
Yes.
I see your link.
Yes, yes, yes. So yeah, sorry, it's just a link. It's not actually a picture of the cover, but it's called Rethinking Learning to Read,
Mm,
and and basically, it's a contrast of all the pressure that a child experiences in school, and that it has to happen all at a certain time, regardless of whether the child is interested or ready on all sorts of measures, physically, emotionally, intellectually, all of those things. It just has to happen at a certain time. And then all the issues that occur when the child isn't ready and they become pathologized,
yeah, yeah.
versus in a home environment. So a survey was done in the UK, and I think she had something like 373 respondents. So it was quite a big, a large number of folk who responded and who basically gave a very intricate description of how the kids in their home learned. And the range was incredible, from kids who could learn to read from the age of 3 all the way to 16. And the same themes emerged over and over again, that if kids are left to learn at their own time and in their own speed and in their own way, that it does eventually happen. And what's amazing about that is that the child usually retains the joy
Mm,
in reading afterwards. Whereas what I found in my environment is that, sure, I can get kids to a certain mechanical level of being able to read by the end of grade 2, but after a year or more of intervention, they are so the hell in with the process
yeah,
that I can't actually imagine them picking up a book out of sheer joy or interest for a long time. It might happen in time, but I feel like I'm turning down the flame, and it's really, really sad because I don't know how long it takes for that to come back again, if ever,
yeah,
and it's so forced and it's so like, read this word, no, no, read it properly, let's sound it out now and compare it to the other word, and don't forget the spelling. And it's just so mechanical and dry, and also the child is not given the opportunity to hide. So what I've really found really interesting in a lot of these accounts of homeschoolers and unschoolers is that they say that often their kids used to hide what they could read. So they used to hide the level of their skill until they felt able to sort of,
yeah,
come out into the open and read a page or read a few words in a row. But they almost needed to have a safe space where it was just them beginning to learn how to decode and how to read, text around them and so on. And then when they felt at ease, they could then come out into the open. Whereas I do exactly the opposite at school. I put a I put I put a spotlight on them, and we all do, And there's no place for a child to hide and to say, just give me a few months or give me a couple of years. I want to play in the sandpit a bit more. I just want to be a kid.
yeah,
Yeah, I found that very interesting as well. Very sad.
yeah. I think you've really got it there because also, I mean, Andrew, your example, which we heard the whole of, which was great. Thank you. Your sharing
Yes, that
there.
was great.
You know, you were re-inspiring the interest. Um,
Yes,
they
exactly.
were coming back at reading for a purpose, for their own purpose, for a reason that made sense to them. Um, and yeah, as you're saying there, Lynn, that reading isn't a mechanical thing that we do in order to be able to do it. It's in order to be able
Yeah.
to empower ourselves and delight ourselves. And
Mm.
when those two things are separated, it's dangerous.
Yeah.
But then,
Yeah, exactly.
yeah, but I mean, as you say, in a schooled environment, um, it is necessary. If it were true, um, if it were true that it was best for children to learn in a linear curricular way, and master exactly that content in those years, the way that it is believed to be true, then it is critical that children learn to read as early as possible. So I mean that's also where I've been
Yeah.
thinking a lot about this sort of how the paradigm shift has to be fairly complete before it's going to work. Because I've heard of a number, just sort
Yeah.
of anecdotally, I've heard of a number of experiments where people have
Mm.
tried to introduce elements of self direction and failed. I mean, I remember even
Yeah.
Theo's nursery teacher, when he tried to, yeah, anyway, whatever. I remember her saying she'd been through all of these experimental processes in the education system, and one of them she
Mm.
described as leaving the box of books in the corner because the children will just teach themselves to read, and of course that didn't happen. Um, and of course it wouldn't happen.
Mm.
Um,
No, it
that
wouldn't.
the environment needs to be thoroughly a self-directed education environment, because the moment that
Yeah.
you've got, as you're saying, that spotlight, the moment the spotlight is on a
Yes.
child, the
Yes.
safety isn't there. So if you've got a
Yes.
spotlight on a child and now you leave them to self-direct, um,
Yeah.
I mean, what's the worst kind of stage fright? To be standing on the stage
Yeah.
and have no lines.
Exactly. No, no. So exactly that you can't waft in and out of it. And I'm beginning to grasp this as well, is that it actually all boils down to trust.
Yeah,
And the mainstream school environment is completely built on fear. It's the fear that our kids won't make it, and it's the fear that they won't learn the right thing at the right time in the right way. And it's all about competition. So it's about, I'm afraid as a mom that my kids won't be able to compete in the marketplace one day. And that drills down all the way down to grade one, where I'm afraid that they won't learn to read at the right time, in sync with all their peers. And if the other kids who learn to read, quicker than mine, then it's a disaster. So it's completely the opposite in an ST environment, which, from what I can see from the outside, is completely based on trust. It's trust that the child is a being who must learn because it's in their genes. It's the way we've evolved that we do learn, but that it doesn't necessarily look the way we want it to, and that it's a long term process. So at school, it's all about short term goals. It's not even just by the end of grade one. It's by the end of the first term in grade covered X, Y, and Z, and the child must have passed this assessment and that assessment. And if they haven't passed all of these assessments by June, we call the folks in, we tell them your child is behind, they need intervention. And just the fear and the anxiety and the stress is a thing to behold. It really is. But
And
the
they're moving it
SDE
earlier as well.
is hey, sorry,
And they are moving it earlier as well into nursery
is
school.
it is becoming earlier. So the kids in the school where I work, so we have a preschool and a grade R, and then grade one and grade two on my campus, and then the grade three is the prep school across the road. But on my campus, kids as young as 4 are going to speech intervention because they're not articulating well, and if you can't articulate well, then it means that you won't be able to read well.
oh,
So they're 4 years old and they're going to speech intervention twice a week, you know?
yeah.
And that's
Mm.
how it starts.
Yeah, and there as well. I mean, I'm just thinking of a family that I know that refused to take their children for speech intervention
Mm,
and
mm,
was good friends with another family who did take their children for speech intervention.
yeah.
Thalia, you also know these two families. I think you probably know who I'm talking about. And I couldn't really see,
Yes.
I couldn't see an advantage in the children who were getting the therapy versus the children who weren't getting the therapy, and it's all evened out now that they're older.
Mm,
So I think
mm,
not to say that there's no value to these things. I think there is. I think that it's just that we are maybe not reserving these interventions for where they're really needed. We may be
yeah.
inadvertently creating more need for them than there actually would be if we didn't create that
Yeah.
need. but only,
Yes.
I mean, look, we really don't know. There isn't enough research yet. The um, there just isn't enough research yet because everything is so mainstreamed, um,
Yeah.
that this
That's
pool of
exactly it.
alternative
Yeah.
information is so small. So we don't
Yes.
know.
Yes.
There might be children who need this speech intervention. I mean, obviously there are children who do. Well, I don't know. I can't even say that. Um,
Yeah.
I mean, I would be very interested. I mean, we've mentioned this before. I would be very interested to see what would a self-directed remedial environment look like if such a thing were
Yes.
to exist. Because
Well, I
obviously,
can't even imagine it. You know? It's.
yeah, well, I mean, there's definitely. I mean, even even if it's only in the cases of brain damage, there's going to be somebody who does
Mm,
need help. And then somebody
yes.
who
Yes.
knows all of the different possible kinds of help would be in a very, very good position to do variations on what you did there, Andrew, by strewing or offering or making
Mm,
sure that they know it's available so that they can see what they resonate with. Um,
mm,
because, I mean, what I've seen with children in our environment is that they definitely resonate with what they need. Um, and they do seem drawn to what they need. Sometimes in a way that, I kind of look at it and make sense of it from my analytical perspective, and maybe I'm just projecting, but a child with so-called dysgraphia doing fine needlework to me is doing remediation.
oh,
um,
yes. Yes.
so if they didn't have the spotlight, and a child who
Mm,
maybe was taking longer and feeling uncomfortable about it for their own reasons, not because they were under pressure, um,
mm,
could be offered a rich environment that is rich in alternative tools to tackle whatever it is they're struggling with. I mean,
mm,
I'm just sort of
mm,
thinking, for example, at the moment, and we've got a gymnastics class at the moment happening at Riverstone.
mm,
Now, kids can teach themselves to flip on the trampoline and do the splits, and many of them have. But many of them value that coaching, and that advice on
mm,
how to stretch the particular muscle that's still too tight. They value that and they seek it out. Um,
mm,
so I would imagine the same would apply. I mean, maybe some of the self-directed kids would like to learn a little bit faster with the reading, and that if there was a stress-free, fun, beautiful relationship way to access more resources, then they might choose to do that.
mm, yeah.
I don't know what your thoughts are
Yeah,
on all of that.
I mean,
um,
Yeah.
may I chip in again?
Yes. Yes.
My master's degree was basically in psycholinguistics, and it was a very finely focused and specialized focus because it was researching the language acquisition of prelingually profoundly deaf children. In other words, they couldn't hear themselves speak and they'd never heard sound before.
Mm,
They all needed some way of establishing rhythm, and it was usually through picking up the vibrations. And I compared the education of children in Holland and children in Britain with what I knew of children in South Africa. And
mm,
the experiment that I put together was a qualitative experiment. I only had a sample of about 20 children, I think, in Holland and in England. The question was, there was two schools of thought. The one was that deaf children, like dogs, have to be conditioned into language. They don't acquire language on their own. And the other one was they can acquire language on their own if they're
mm,
given the resources. And so
mm,
the most successful education of children I picked up in Holland, the St. Michael's Gestel School for Dwarfen. And they had four different types of schools for deaf, prelingually profoundly deaf children. One was dyspraxic, where brain function made it difficult for the children to sequence sounds.
mm,
And there were various other neurological differences. There was then an intellectual differentiator as well. Because in Holland, the adolescents who were over a tested IQ of 120, in those days we still did IQ tests, um,
Mm.
were encouraged to study a second language. So they learned to speak and read Dutch. Then they learned to speak and read either English or French. And they were taught. But in English, what I did was most adolescents in English at that time, they had used their own sign language. And they had different ways of indicating auxiliary verb tenses. They didn't know how to use auxiliary verbs. So the child would say, yesterday I will be going to the movies. And um, tomorrow I went to the movies. So they had no idea about the tense mark, the time markers. So
Mm.
I constructed a series of pictures which were easily understood and painted them so they were fairly attractive. And they were stimuli for the child to tell me what was happening. And I would resort to their sign language to look at the tense markers. And it was interesting that at first it puzzled them. What was this guy doing? He was indicating about the same sentence, the same picture. What's it like tomorrow? What's it like today? And what's it like yesterday? And they were
Mm.
puzzled because they would give me the same tense and time mark for the three answers. But I've given it to you. Why should one do it? Why should I do it again? And then suddenly, by using the sign language that they were showing me for tomorrow, yesterday, and today, I got them to write down the responses and then saw the penny drop. They had discovered their own way of understanding the auxiliary verb for time. You just saw the lights go on, and then suddenly there was an inspiration to study further, to go further. And then they started
Mm.
asking questions about the different forms of the verb.
Mm.
So that, for me and for my supervisors and examiners, demonstrated that the Chomskyan school of deep structure, where the
Mm.
child is instinctively equipped to learn a language, and if you don't teach the child a language or the child doesn't have exposure to a particular language, they will create their own language.
Mm. Mm.
So, a long explanation, but basically saying that I think, provided you create the curiosity in a certain way, and it doesn't put the child off, doesn't put the child under a spotlight, it's the kind of game you're playing together, then I think new learning is possible. And that's
Mm.
also in coaching. In coaching, I
Mm.
don't tell people, I don't teach people unless they ask.
Mm.
But I do ask questions to get them to think about what are they saying, what are they thinking.
Yeah.
Mm.
So the development comes from within,
Yeah.
And
in a relationship with somebody that is not criticizing you and is not putting you under pressure.
yes,
Yeah.
the adult who's a helper, not a judge or a critic. I mean, that's one
And
of
it's
the
actually a playful
a
process too.
playmate. Yeah,
Mm.
you're being a
A playmate.
playmate with them,
Yeah, yeah,
and it's completely consensual.
yep.
Mm.
Because I mean, just going back to the gymnastics example, there are some kids who are very interested in doing exactly what the kids in the gymnastics group are doing, but they don't want to join the gymnastics group, but they'll often hang around on the jungle gym if there's things happening on the trampoline, for example, and
Mm.
watch the group. Um,
Mm.
and that's also where I wonder about this sort of, again, the spotlight and the very, very individual focus that we have of splitting people off from each other rather than offering something at a communal level. And sorry, just back to age mixing. Um,
Mm.
I
I was
wonder,
thinking the same thing.
if also one of the reasons why we don't see the difficulty with reading in the self-directed facilities is because of the age mixing. Because if a
Mm.
12-year-old is exposed to a 5-year-old who's learning to read, it can be like watching the flips on the jungle gym without joining in. There's so many
Yes.
ways to pick up the information.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Mm.
And wealthy resources are really important. Holland was streets ahead of Britain, and Britain was streets
Mm.
ahead of South Africa. In Holland,
Yeah.
they were mainly weekly boarders. They went home for the weekends. But during the week, they lived in a house with three house parents, four children per house, four children to three, basically, supervisors,
Yeah.
teachers, facilitators.
Yeah.
Mm.
And
Although they,
most of three had PhDs. They made a special study of language development for these children.
yeah. Although
Mm.
there you're talking about an environment where there is a lot of help needed, a lot of support needed.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Whereas, I mean, your
And
ratios
that goes back
wouldn't
to
need your ratios and your resources don't have to be nearly as intensive if you're you see, I hate this language. I don't want to say normal,
yes,
Dealing with,
but if you're dealing with children who don't have that level of challenge with the task,
yeah,
um,
yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. I think if I can just add another thing that really has hit home with me is the time lost. So a child who battles at school, um, if they get the intervention, which is in a well-resourced school and is regarded as being a really good thing, they spend a hang of a lot of time getting extra input. So it's extra lessons after school, it's extra homework which they have to do on top of their school homework, which they battle with because they're struggling, right? So I've got kids as young as 7 who are spending over an hour on homework a day at the end of the day. So like after the sun has gone down,
yeah,
and it's just completely bizarre. And the point is that kids are so frazzled and exhausted and tired, like bone tired in their brain and in their body and in every part of them by the end of the day, that there's no space to pursue their own interests or their own strengths. So they're completely living in a, a deficit world where all everybody can see about them is that they aren't good enough. And these young kids are just trying to match them. They're just trying to match up to the lowest possible expectation of them, and they it's a struggle.
mm,
So there's no time in their world to pursue things that really turn them on, things that they are gifted with. And when you think about the opportunity cost, it's actually hectic to think that these kids may never find the thing that they really love because they're trying to attain they just trying to make it in a world that is not giving them the time and the space. They might just need 2 or 3 more years, but they aren't allowed that time. And that is really also very sad.
Mm.
well, yeah, and I think even more than that, if you look at the definition of education under self-directed education, in terms of
Mm,
acquiring the skills and knowledge that you need to live your own individual life successfully
mm,
according to your own definitions of success, that actually
mm,
becomes an education prevention process. So, I mean, if
exactly.
you're going to come back to children's rights and human rights, if you are
Mm,
putting somebody through an educational process that actually prevents their education, um,
mm,
I mean,
mm.
I'm just struck with how you're describing these children, and I'm thinking of children in factories and sweatshops. And,
Exactly. It's very industrial revolution times, very much so.
but then,
It's
why go to all this trouble to prevent child labor if we're going to replace it with child labor?
exactly,
mm,
exactly.
But
yeah,
as you
It's the
say,
strangest thing.
yeah, but as you
Es
say, the people who are
especially
doing it don't
especially
see it.
No, and I have often got really good intentions. They really think that they're helping kids. And what's bizarre is that in the last 10 years, I'd say there's been all this research about the importance of play. And and it's out there. People are reading it, people are talking about it.
Hmm.
But kids are given such little opportunity to actually play. And
Yes.
and also, like, once they hit grade one, the opportunities to play at school in the school day are very, very small. And I remember my middle child, when she arrived in grade one, after a few days, I would talk to her after every day. How did it go? What happened? What was good? What was bad? And all that. And she was completely shocked by the fact that they couldn't play as much as they could play in grade R. And she kept saying, "But mom, there's hardly any time to play, and they make us work all the time. We've got to work, work, work." And it hit me so hard then when I realized that she's not much older than she was a few months ago, and yet everything in her world has changed. And now she needs to work at a desk for the majority of her school day. Whereas in grade R, which was just a few months, prior, she was allowed to play most of the day at school, and it was regarded as a good thing. So I thought to myself, so what's changed in a few months? Like, she's still like only 6, and
Mm.
yet her whole world has changed. And so it's this weird thing where the research is out there, and schools are talking about the importance of play, but it's total lip service because those
Mm,
opportunities are not there in the school day.
My experience when I've been inside the walls of the education department in South Africa is
Mm,
that they really don't know what to do because the pressure is on
mm,
to cover this
mm.
curriculum and master this curriculum, and this curriculum is huge. And as the body of
Yeah.
human knowledge expands, they have to try and cram more and more into the curriculum.
Mm,
And I mean, that's
exactly.
where it's like you have the sports people saying, please, can we have 2 hours a week of sports? And the minister
Mm,
saying, sorry, we can't afford more than 45 minutes. You're lucky to have that. Um,
yeah. Yeah.
and I know in the States where they are extending the school hours and taking away the recess, and because
Yes.
everybody's
Yeah.
there's this fundamental myth, the first
Yes.
sort of underlying myth, that mastering the curriculum is necessary.
Yeah.
And I think
Yeah.
until there's that mind shift of realizing that mastering a set curriculum doesn't give you any particular advantage when you look at
Mm,
education in terms of helping me live my individual life well. I think that that's
yes.
that's the
Yeah.
first shift that has to happen, to understand that for my
Yeah.
individual life, I need to master what I need to master, and that's going to be different for every person. Because if I'm
Yes.
expected to master what I individually need to master as well as mastering the set curriculum, it can't be done.
No, it's almost impossible.
We have to
Yeah.
pick one. Which one are you going to do?
Mm, mm. It's a huge mind shift that it's hard to imagine it happening in the mainstream, you know. Um, I think what really needs to happen is that in the SDE environment, and I see this online because there's a lot of activity online, is that if there can be more research and more examples of kids who are living their own life on their own terms. But you see, it would have to look good to the mainstream. It can't look less. Otherwise, they're going to say, well, you see, it just makes the point that an SDE environment isn't as good as a highly stressed mainstream environment. But I guess my point is that the more examples we have in time that we can put in front of folk. Like, I think if I had known the stuff as a young mom when my kids were small, and had a few years to chew on it before they got to school age, it I think it would certainly have given me pause to think about. Um, so yeah, I hope that in time this information is going to be more easily accessible out there, even in the mainstream as a viable alternative.
Yeah. I just want to pick up here on Tasha's comment because I think it's also quite an interesting comment. Yeah, how do people decide what is needed to know? because ultimately only I can
mm,
decide what I need to know, because only I know what makes a difference to my life. And that's really the
mm,
principle of self-directed education, is to wait for me to feel a need and then I'll acquire the knowledge. I have recently wondered if I had the resources, I'd love to put up a self-directed collaborative kind of Wikipedia of what kids recommend other kids know. Like
mm,
what would be the kind of general knowledge repository where you would
mm.
say, okay, days of the week, months of the year, how to
I,
how to calculate your change up to several thousand, whatever, or whatever the kids
mm,
felt was important. You really need to know who PewDiePie is, need to know how to ride a bicycle. I would be fascinated to
mm,
see what kids would suggest to other kids, and to have that kind of
mm,
repository where kids could go
mm,
and say, okay,
mm,
what are the other kids suggesting that I cover in order to be a rounded person? I mean, I
mm,
think that would be a really interesting way to approach. Um,
mm,
because I mean, on the conference that we were on the weekend, one of the mom's main concerns was how, in a
mm,
self-directed, home-based environment, can you keep your child sufficiently in touch with the mainstream that they're not a stranger in their own land. And to some
mm,
extent, I don't think there's any answer to that, because we're living in a place that is so diverse now that even in one's own land, you are a stranger in your own land, because there's just so many niches, so
mm,
many long tails,
mm,
that you are going
mm,
to be a stranger to the person next to you. But on the other
mm.
hand, yeah, I mean, that might be fun. But I do think that we are really past the point where a curriculum designer can design something standardized and expect it to work for more than a
For
tiny,
the
tiny
whole,
fraction
yeah,
of
for
people.
the whole country. Yeah, I totally agree. Um, I also, this also raises quite an interesting point about trying to do SDE at home, because from what I can read, it seems like it's much, much, much richer to do it in community um, than to do it on your own at home with your own kids, because of the whole, the age mixing and being exposed to other people and their strengths and their ideas and their resources, and learning how to get along with a larger group of folk, and having to come up with your own rules and all of that type of thing, I would think is much more effective in a larger environment than at home, which I think is part of the school experience in an SDE way. I'm not talking about in a mainstream way. I don't know
Yeah,
if that makes sense.
yeah, absolutely.
Mm,
A learning community.
mm.
I think, yes, I think
Exactly.
that the problem is that um, it is so difficult for kids to have access to the world, for kids to have access to the
Yeah,
world.
yeah,
Yeah.
So trying to do SDE at home, there's less access. There's less,
exactly.
Well, I think there's a reason why
you
kids
know?
at home spend a lot of time on the screen, because the screen becomes the access to the wider world now that we have the internet.
Yeah,
I mean, there Tasha's saying
yeah,
YouTube. I mean, I said to that mom, I would let them watch a lot of YouTube. um,
yeah.
but yeah, look, I mean, on the other hand, we could argue that if you had a village where children could free range and the adults were
Mm,
generally egalitarian rather than being judgmental and critical, then you
mm.
might
Mm,
not need a facility at all. But given that
Yeah.
we don't really have those villages, then the
Mm,
SDE facility becomes like an artificial village. And then it's just a question of
yeah,
how
makes
exactly you're
sense.
going to structure it, because one of the critical things is, one of the other conversations that we recently had at our social day, is that children definitely need unsupervised, out of the adult's wing time. They need to be able to escape their parents. So that's also where there is an advantage to creating an SDE facility, um, rather than just get togethers, um, with the mother's still always going to be, or the parent is always going to be the go to person for the child who's there. Am I still here? Can you hear me? I can't hear you. I see you lighting up. I'm going to quickly drop back in again. Hello?
Hello.
Okay.
Hello?
Hello.
We can.
Okay. So, yeah, we've pretty much used the call up on this topic, which I think is great because I think it's been very,
Mm,
very rich.
Um,
thank you.
yeah, Tasha's question is relevant. What about when you work where your child does the STE at an STE facility?
Mm,
Try to avoid them. They're free to
mm,
avoid me.
Mm,
I mean, I was very interested. I asked Daniel Greenberg that one time, and he sort of said the same kind of thing. Um, and it's almost it's almost a selection point you can use for staff. Is if a parent um, wants to follow their child around, they probably shouldn't be staff. If a
mm,
parent is going to try and make sure there's plenty of space, yeah, then they probably should be there. I mean, there's nothing wrong with interacting with your own child and supporting your own child. I mean, one of the other comments on the conference, which I loved, was from a dad who said, you know, we're the only species that gives our young to other people to raise. You know,
mm.
so there's nothing wrong with that interaction, but the children definitely need to be out from under our wing. Otherwise,
Mm,
how do they
Oh, we're
find
all
themselves
reflecting it
independent
then.
of our view of them?
yeah. Mm.
Yeah. Okay, this has been a very, very rich call. Would everybody on this call be okay if I put this, because I usually put the calls in to sort of an our eyes only for SDE facilitators, but I'm thinking there's so much value in this particular one for the public. Would everybody here be okay if I put this one up in the public space?
Sure, sure. I'd be fine with
Yes.
that.
Because then you would also all be free to send the link out to whoever you wanted to send the link out to,
Mm,
which could be valuable for
mm,
some of us, I think.
mm.
Yeah. So
yes, I'm fine with that.
yeah. And then Lynn, I kind of get the sense you're going to either need to write a book or do some podcasts or something because I love how you've spoken in this call and I would love to hear more. And I think a lot of people out there would really benefit from hearing this voice and the way that you're articulating things is really, really very rich.
Thanks, Yana.
Mm,
Thank you. Now, I appreciate the opportunity also to just sort of drone on a bit while I try and process, all the
mm-hmm.
stuff that's happening.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which of course is an SDE principle that, you know, we tell it back to
Yes, yes, it
somebody
is.
and through that social interaction we consolidate what we're learning as well as
Yes, of
making it
course.
available for the other people that are interacting.
Hmm.
So thank you for that.
Yeah. Yeah, great.
Okay. I'm just going to stop the recording, but then I have one or two notes to